He was a lonely farmer who bought a horse nobody wanted and discovered why 3 men had died after owning it. Can you imagine purchasing an animal that an entire town fears, only to uncover a truth so dark it had been buried for years? This isn't just a story about a horse. It's a story about justice, redemption, and how sometimes the most broken souls can lead us to the light. This really happened in Wyoming during the 1880s. Before we continue, go ahead and subscribe to the channel and leave your like, because the ending of this story will leave you speechless. What this farmer discovered changed not only his life, but brought peace to a tortured soul that had been waiting for 2 long years. And tell me here in the comments, what state are you watching this story from? I'd love to know how far these emotional stories are reaching. It was late November of 1881 when Thomas Whitaker felt the first bite of winter in the air. He stood on the porch of his ranch in the Wind River Valley of Wyoming Territory, looking out at the mountains already capped with snow. The sky was heavy and gray, promising a storm. He needed to get to town before the roads became impassable. Winter in Wyoming was unforgiving, and once the heavy snows came, he could be isolated for weeks. Thomas was 45 years old, though he looked older. His face was weathered and lined from years of hard work and harder grief. His hair, once dark brown, was now streaked with silver. His eyes, a pale blue, held a distance in them, as if he was always looking at something far away, something no one else could see. He had been alone for 5 years now. His wife, Rebecca, and their son Daniel, who was only 7 years old, had died during a scarlatina epidemic that swept through the valley. Thomas had been away, buying cattle in Cheyenne, when it happened. By the time he returned, they were already buried in the small cemetery on the hill behind the house. He hadn't been able to save them, hadn't even been able to say goodbye. That guilt ate at him every single day. After their deaths, Thomas closed himself off from the world. He stopped going to church gatherings, stopped accepting dinner invitations from neighbors. He lived for his work and nothing else. The ranch was his prison and his refuge. Thomas saddled his horse, a reliable mare named Bess, and began the 12-mile ride into Lander, the nearest town. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of snow. He pulled his coat tighter and urged Bess forward. The ride took just over 2 hours. When he arrived in Lander, the main street was busy with people preparing for winter. Wagons loaded with supplies, families buying flour and sugar in bulk, men securing their businesses before the long, cold months ahead. Thomas tied Bess to a hitching post outside the general store and went inside. He bought the essentials: coffee, salt, dried beans, tobacco, lamp oil. As he was loading his saddlebags, he heard a commotion in the town square. A crowd had gathered near the livestock pens. Thomas normally avoided crowds, but something made him walk over. In the center of the square, a livestock auctioneer stood on a wooden platform. Below him, in a reinforced pen, was a horse. But this wasn't just any horse. It was a magnificent black stallion, probably 16 hands high, with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the light. But the animal was in terrible condition. Its ribs showed through its sides. Its mane was tangled and matted with burrs, and across its flanks and shoulders were scars, dozens of them, some old and silvered, others still pink and healing. Whip marks, burn marks. The horse's eyes were wild, rolling white with fear and rage. It paced the small pen, snorting and stamping, its ears pinned flat against its skull. "Lot number 47, the auctioneer called out. "Black stallion, approximately 7 years old. Strong build, good bones. Starting bid, $50. Silence. Nobody moved. The auctioneer frowned. "Come now, gentlemen. This is a fine animal. $40? Still nothing. An old man standing near Thomas spat tobacco juice into the dirt. "Nobody's going to bid on that devil horse, Clarence. You know what happened." The auctioneer's face darkened. "That's just superstition, Frank." "Superstition?" Frank laughed bitterly. 3 men are dead. That ain't superstition. That's a curse. Thomas felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the wind. "What do you mean, 3 men are dead?" he asked quietly. Frank turned to him, squinting. "You ain't from around here, are you?" "I live up in Wind River Valley. Keep to myself mostly." Well, then you wouldn't know. That horse there, it's killed 3 owners. First was Robert Hutchins, a merchant. Bought the horse last year. A week later, his wagon overturned on the road to Riverton. Broke his neck. Second owner was Dutch Morrison, rancher from over by Sweetwater. Found him dead in his barn, trampled to death. Third was Carl Jensen, best horse trainer in the territory. He took the horse 6 months ago, said he'd break it proper. He disappeared, vanished. They found his hat and 1 boot near Sinks Canyon, but never found him. Thomas looked back at the horse. The animal had stopped pacing and was staring directly at him. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Recognition. Not of the horse itself, but of something in its eyes. Pain, loss, rage at the world. It was like looking in a mirror. $30, the auctioneer called, sounding desperate now. 20, someone give me $20. I'll give you 5, Thomas heard himself say. The crowd turned to stare at him. The auctioneer blinked in surprise. $5? Sir, this is a valuable animal. That animal is half-starved, covered in scars, and according to everyone here, cursed. $5 is generous. The auctioneer looked around the square. No one else spoke. He sighed. Sold. $5, and may God have mercy on your soul. As Thomas paid and signed the bill of sale, the auctioneer leaned in close. You sure about this, mister? I ain't one for superstition, but that horse carries something dark with it. 3 men dead ain't coincidence. Maybe they deserved it, Thomas said quietly. The auctioneer pulled back, startled. Thomas took the lead rope, though he knew he wouldn't be able to lead the horse like a normal animal. The stallion would need to be herded, not led. You got a name for him? The auctioneer asked. Thomas looked at the horse, at those eyes, black and fathomless. Shadow, he said. His name is Shadow. The journey back to the ranch was difficult. Shadow wouldn't let Thomas within 10 feet of him. Thomas had to ride Bess and keep Shadow moving ahead, like herding a wild Mustang. The stallion was skittish, jumping at every sound, ready to bolt at any moment. But he kept moving north, toward the ranch, as if he knew where they were going. By the time they arrived, the first snow was falling, large, wet flakes that stuck to everything. Thomas managed to get Shadow into the barn, into a large box stall with high walls. The horse immediately retreated to the far corner, trembling, eyes showing white. Thomas put out feed and water, then left him alone. That night, as Thomas sat by his fire eating a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, he heard it. A sound from the barn. Not the usual sounds of horses settling for the night. This was different. It was a long, mournful whinny, almost like a cry. Then silence. Then it came again. Thomas set down his plate and walked out into the snow, carrying a lantern. He entered the barn. Shadow was standing at the stall door, not trying to escape, but looking intently toward the north wall of the barn, toward the forest beyond. The horse's ears were pricked forward, every muscle tense, as if listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. "What is it, boy?" Thomas asked softly. "What do you hear?" Shadow turned his head and looked at Thomas. For just a moment, the wildness in his eyes faded, replaced by something that looked almost like pleading. Then the horse whinnied again, that same mournful sound, and turned back to staring north. Thomas felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't normal horse behavior. This was something else, something he couldn't explain. The next morning, Thomas began the slow work of gaining Shadow's trust. He didn't try to touch the horse. He simply sat on a stool outside the stall and talked. He talked about nothing important, about the weather, about the work that needed doing around the ranch, about Rebecca and Daniel. He hadn't spoken their names aloud in years, but somehow, with this broken horse, it felt safe. "She had red hair," Thomas said quietly, his voice rough with disuse. "Like autumn leaves. And Daniel, he looked just like her. Same hair, same green eyes, same laugh." Shadow's ears flicked toward him, listening. "I wasn't here when they died. I was off buying cattle, thinking I was building something for our future." But there was no future, just empty rooms and silence. Thomas wiped his eyes. I know you've been hurt too. I can see it. Those scars didn't come from accidents. Someone did that to you. Someone cruel. The horse took a step closer to the stall door. Just one step, but it was something. This became Thomas's routine. Every morning and evening, he'd sit with Shadow and talk. And slowly, over days and then weeks, the horse began to trust him. First, Shadow would eat while Thomas was in the barn. Then he'd let Thomas stand near the stall door. Then finally, one snowy morning 3 weeks after Thomas brought him home, Shadow walked up to the stall door and lowered his head. Thomas slowly, carefully, reached out his hand. Shadow flinched but didn't pull away. Thomas's fingers touched the horse's forehead just between his eyes. Shadow's eyes closed. It was the first gentle touch he'd received in God knew how long. "Good boy," Thomas whispered. Good boy, but every night without fail, Shadow would stand at the stall door and stare north toward the forest. And every night, he would make that mournful crying sound. It haunted Thomas. What was out there? What was the horse trying to tell him? Thomas decided he needed answers. He needed to know Shadow's history, know what had happened to him. The next time he went to town for supplies, he asked around. He learned that Shadow had originally belonged to someone named Sarah Jensen. And that name, Jensen, rang a bell. Carl Jensen, the horse trainer who'd disappeared, must have been related. Thomas found the town clerk, a nervous little man named Horace, and asked about Sarah Jensen. Horace's face went pale. "Why are you asking about her?" "I bought her horse." "I want to know what happened." Horace licked his lips. "Sarah Jensen disappeared 2 years ago. She lived alone in a cabin up near Sinks Canyon. Kept to herself mostly. She'd lost her husband and daughter in a fire years before, and she just withdrew from society. The only thing she cared about was that horse of hers. Called him Shadow. Beautiful animal. Then one day she didn't come to town for her usual supplies. When people went to check on her, the cabin was empty. No sign of struggle, no note, nothing. Just gone. The horse was found wandering in the forest, covered in blood. But they never found Sarah. And Carl Jensen?" Thomas asked. "Her brother-in-law. He took the horse, said he'd care for it in her memory. Then he vanished too." Thomas felt ice in his veins. "What about the other 2 men? Robert Hutchins and Dutch Morrison?" Horace looked around nervously, as if afraid someone would overhear. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but there were rumors. Robert Hutchins had been courting Sarah, if you can call it that. More like pestering her. She'd rejected him multiple times, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. And Dutch Morrison, well, Sarah had inherited some good grazing land from her late husband. Dutch wanted it, tried to buy it, tried to pressure her, even claimed she owed him money, which wasn't true. Thomas's mind was racing. So 3 men connected to Sarah Jensen all died after owning her horse. That's why people say it's cursed. Shadow killed them, or brought death to them somehow. Or, Thomas said slowly, the horse knew something, and he was trying to tell someone. Horace stared at him. That's crazy talk, mister. Maybe, or maybe that horse has been trying to lead someone to the truth for 2 years, and everyone's been too superstitious to listen." Thomas left town with more questions than answers. But he knew what he had to do. He had to find out what happened to Sarah Jensen. And he believed deep in his gut that Shadow could show him. But before he could go searching in the mountains, he needed to know more. He needed to talk to someone who understood the land, the animals, the old ways. He needed to talk to Two Clouds. Two Clouds was a Shoshone elder who lived in a small cabin high in the mountains. He was ancient, no one knew exactly how old, and he rarely came down to the valley. But he was known as a wise man, someone who understood things that others didn't. It took Thomas a full day to ride up to Two Clouds' cabin. The old man was outside, splitting wood despite his age, his long white hair braided down his back. "I was wondering when you would come," Two Clouds said in perfect English, not looking up from his work. "How did you know I was coming?" "The wind told me." "And the horse told me." Thomas dismounted. "You know about Shadow?" Two Clouds finally looked up, his dark eyes sharp and clear. "I know about the black horse who grieves. I know about the woman who was taken, and I know about the 3 men who carried guilt in their hearts." "Tell me," Thomas said. Two Clouds invited him inside. The cabin was small but warm, filled with the smell of sage and wood smoke. They sat on simple wooden chairs, and the old man poured them both tea from a battered pot. The woman, Sarah, she had a gift, Two Clouds began. She could understand animals in a way most people cannot. Her horse Shadow was not just a pet to her. He was family. The only family she had left after the fire took her husband and child. What happened to her? 3 men wanted things from her. One wanted her body. One wanted her land. One wanted her horse. She refused them all. They grew angry, desperate. One night they went to her cabin together. They thought they could frighten her, force her to give them what they wanted. Thomas's hands clenched into fists. They killed her. Her body was never found. But yes, I believe they killed her. And the horse saw everything. Horses remember, Mr. Whitaker. They remember kindness, and they remember cruelty. Shadow saw what those men did. And when each of them took him, thinking they could own him, use him, he made sure they paid. How? Thomas asked. How could a horse? The first man, the merchant, he tried to beat Shadow into submission. The horse waited until they were on a dangerous mountain road. Then he spooked. The wagon went over. The second man, the rancher, he tried to break Shadow with cruelty. He used whips and hot irons. One night in the barn, Shadow fought back. And the third man, Carl Jensen, he knew the truth. He was Sarah's family. He knew what the other 2 had done to his sister-in-law, and he'd said nothing. He'd helped cover it up because he wanted the horse, wanted to sell it for good money. Shadow led him into the mountains, into Sinks Canyon where the ground is treacherous, and Carl fell into one of the deep sinkholes. His body is still there in the dark. Thomas felt sick. Justice, he said quietly. The horse was getting justice. More than that, Two Clouds said. The horse was trying to tell someone where Sarah is. Every person who owned him, he tried to lead them north, into the forest, to the place where she fell. But they wouldn't listen. They thought he was just wild, dangerous. They never understood what he was trying to say. He stares north every night, Thomas said, from the barn. He cries and stares north. Because she is there, Mr. Whitaker, waiting to be found. Waiting for someone to care enough to look, Thomas stood up. Then I'll find her. Will you help me? Two Clouds smiled, a sad, knowing smile. That is why you were meant to buy that horse. Not the others, you. Because you understand loss. You understand what it means to be left alone with ghosts. Yes, I will help you. They made plans to search when the weather cleared. But Wyoming winter doesn't wait for anyone's convenience. That very night, a massive storm rolled in. Snow fell so thick Thomas couldn't see more than a few feet in front of his face. The wind howled like wolves. He secured the ranch as best he could and settled in to wait it out. But Shadow wouldn't settle. The horse was frantic in his stall, kicking the walls, whinnying that mournful cry over and over. Thomas went to the barn. I know, boy, I know. But we can't go out in this. We'd die in the storm. Shadow turned to look at him, and Thomas saw something in those dark eyes. Urgency. Not tonight, the eyes seemed to say. But soon, please, soon. I promise, Thomas said. I promise when the storm breaks we'll go. We'll find her. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of howling wind and endless snow. 3 days of Shadow's restless pacing and mournful cries. 3 days of Thomas preparing himself for what they might find. On the morning of the 4th day, the storm broke. The sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue. The world was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow, and everything was perfectly, eerily silent. Thomas saddled Shadow. It was the first time he'd tried, and he half expected the horse to fight him. But Shadow stood perfectly still, as if he understood that this was the moment he'd been waiting for. Thomas also packed supplies, rope, a shovel, blankets. He didn't know what they'd find, but he wanted to be prepared. 2 Clouds appeared just after dawn, riding a spotted pony. The ancestors guided me here, he said simply. We ride north. They rode into the forest, Shadow leading the way. The horse moved with purpose now, all his skittishness gone. He knew where he was going. They climbed higher into the mountains, the snow deeper, the air thinner. The sun was bright but gave no warmth. After several hours, they entered a part of the forest Thomas had never seen before. The trees here were old massive pines that blocked out most of the light. The snow was shallower under their thick canopy. Shadow stopped at the edge of a ravine. It was narrow, steep, hidden by fallen logs and underbrush. You'd never see it unless you knew exactly where to look. The horse lowered his head and made a soft, grieving sound. She's down there, 2 Clouds said quietly. Thomas dismounted and carefully made his way to the edge. He looked down. 20 feet below, partially covered by snow and debris, he could see fabric. A dress and the shape of a human form. "Sarah," he whispered. It took them over an hour to carefully climb down and reach her. Sarah Jensen's body was remarkably preserved, protected from scavengers by the steep ravine, and covered by layers of fallen leaves and now snow. She'd been there for 2 years. Thomas felt tears freeze on his cheeks as he looked at her. She'd been young, maybe in her early 30s. Her hair was dark, her hands small. She was wearing a simple dress. There was no obvious sign of injury, but Thomas suspected she'd been pushed, had fallen and broken her neck in the fall. They found her satchel nearby. Inside were a few personal items and a small leather journal. Thomas carefully placed Sarah's body in blankets, and they brought her up from the ravine. It was hard, exhausting work in the deep snow. But finally she was on level ground again. Shadow approached slowly, carefully. He lowered his head and touched his muzzle to the blanket-wrapped form. He stood there for a long moment, perfectly still. Then he raised his head and made a sound Thomas had never heard before. Not a whinny, not a cry. It was softer. It sounded almost like relief, like a weight had finally been lifted. "She's not lost anymore," Two Clouds said. "He can rest now." They brought Sarah's body back to the ranch. Thomas notified the sheriff, who came out with a deputy. Thomas explained how he'd come to search the forest, leaving out the parts about Shadow leading them. He said he'd heard rumors about Sarah's disappearance and decided to investigate. The sheriff examined the body and the ravine location. "This wasn't an accident," he said grimly. "Someone brought her out here. The ravine is too isolated, too specific. She didn't just wander here." Thomas showed him Sarah's journal. The sheriff read through it, his face growing darker with each page. The journal told the story of Sarah's last months. Her fear of Robert Hutchins, who wouldn't leave her alone. Her conflicts with Dutch Morrison over her land. And then, the final entry, dated 2 years ago, November 10th, 1879. "Robert came to the cabin again tonight. He was drunk, angry that I'd rejected him again. He said he would make me regret it. I'm frightened. He knows where I live, knows I'm alone. Carl promised he'd come stay with me for a while, but he seems more interested in Shadow than my safety. He keeps asking if he can buy the horse. Why can't people just leave me in peace? If something happens to me, I want it known. I fear Robert Hutchins. I fear Dutch Morrison. And I no longer trust Carl Jensen. Shadow is the only one I trust now. He's the only one who doesn't want anything from me except love. And that I give freely." The sheriff closed the journal. "This is evidence of motive. With what happened to Hutchins and Morrison, and now finding Sarah's body, I think we can piece together what happened. 3 men conspired to pressure Sarah Jensen. Something went wrong. She ended up dead, and then those men turned on each other. Or their guilt ate them alive, or..." He looked at Shadow, who stood quietly near Thomas. "Or that horse made sure they paid for what they did." The sheriff didn't pursue that line of thinking. Some things were better left as mysteries. Sarah Jensen was buried in the Lander Cemetery. Thomas paid for a proper funeral. Nearly the whole town came, guilty perhaps that they'd forgotten about her, that they'd let her disappear without demanding answers. Thomas stood at the graveside with Two Clouds on one side and Shadow on the other. The horse was perfectly calm, quiet. As the preacher spoke words about eternal rest and God's mercy, Shadow lowered his head, and Thomas knew somehow that Sarah would have wanted her horse here, would have wanted him to know she was finally at peace. After the funeral, Thomas led Shadow back to the ranch. That night, for the first time since Thomas had brought him home, Shadow didn't stare north. Didn't make that mournful cry. He ate his feed calmly, drank his water, and lay down in the straw to sleep. The haunting was over. Sarah had been found. Justice, in its strange way, had been served. And Shadow could finally rest. But Thomas's story wasn't over. In the weeks that followed, he read through Sarah's entire journal. He learned about her life, her losses, her loneliness, and he saw himself in her words. She'd isolated herself after tragedy, just as he had. She'd pushed away the world just as he had, and she'd paid the ultimate price for that isolation. No one had been there to help her when she needed it most. Thomas made a decision. He wouldn't let that happen again. Not to himself and not to anyone else if he could help it. He began reaching out to his neighbors again, started attending church again, started accepting those dinner invitations he'd refused for 5 years. And he started something new. He put out the word that his ranch would take in horses that were abused, neglected, or unwanted. Horses like Shadow. horses that people feared or had given up on. The first horse came within a month, a mare that had been starved nearly to death by an owner who'd lost his farm. Then came a gelding that had been beaten for being stubborn. Then a young stallion that had been kept in a stall so small he couldn't even turn around until his legs were damaged and his spirit nearly broken. Thomas took them all, with patience, with kindness, with the same gentle persistence he'd shown Shadow. He rehabilitated them. Some he was able to adopt out to good homes. Others stayed at the ranch, too damaged to ever be ridden, but safe and cared for. Shadow became his partner in this work. The black stallion, once feared as cursed and deadly, became the gentlest horse on the ranch. He had a particular gift for calming the frightened new arrivals. It was as if he understood their trauma, understood their fear, and could somehow communicate that they were safe now. Two Clouds visited often. "You've found your purpose," the old man said one spring afternoon as they watched Shadow grazing peacefully in the meadow with 6 other rescued horses. "Yes," Thomas said. "I think I have. Sarah would be glad. Her horse saved you just as you saved him." Thomas nodded. "We saved each other." That summer, Thomas did something he never thought he'd do again. He opened the room that had belonged to Daniel. It had been closed for 5 years, exactly as his son had left it. Thomas packed away the toys, the small clothes, the drawings carefully. Not to forget, but to let go. He donated most of it to families in town with young children. But he kept a few things. Daniel's favorite wooden horse, a drawing of their family, Rebecca's wedding ring, which Thomas had been unable to even look at for years. He placed these items in a small wooden box and buried it in a beautiful spot on the ranch, under a cottonwood tree where Rebecca used to sit and watch Daniel play. He planted wildflowers there. It wasn't about forgetting them. It was about finally being able to remember them with love instead of just pain. One evening in late summer, as the sun set in brilliant oranges and purples over the mountains, Thomas stood at the fence watching his horses. Shadow came over and rested his head on Thomas's shoulder, something he did now when he wanted affection. Thomas scratched the horse's forehead, right between his eyes, in the spot he'd first touched all those months ago. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly, "for trusting me, for showing me that even the most broken things can heal, for reminding me that isolation isn't safety, it's just another kind of death." Shadow's eyes were soft now, peaceful. The wildness was gone, but the intelligence remained, and Thomas would swear until his dying day that the horse understood every word. The ranch became known throughout the territory. The Whitaker place, people called it, where the broken horses go to heal. Thomas never charged for taking in an animal. He lived simply modestly, supported by the small amount of money he made selling cattle and the generosity of his community. Years passed. Thomas's hair went completely silver. His face gained more lines, but they were different lines now. Not just from grief, but from smiling, from laughing, from living again. Shadow grew older too. His muzzle turned gray. He moved a little slower, but he was content. Deeply, peacefully content. He'd found his justice. He'd found his purpose. And he'd found a human who understood him. On a cold November morning, exactly 7 years after Thomas had bought Shadow at that auction in Lander, he went out to the barn to find the old black stallion lying in his stall. Shadow was still breathing, but barely. His eyes were closed. Thomas knelt in the straw beside him. He placed his hand on Shadow's neck. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You can rest now. You've done everything you needed to do. Sarah is at peace. The horses you helped are safe. You can rest." Shadow's eyes opened one last time. They looked at Thomas with what could only be described as gratitude. Then, with one final gentle breath, he was gone. Thomas buried Shadow on the hill behind the ranch, next to the cottonwood tree, where Rebecca and Daniel's memorial was. It seemed fitting, all the souls he'd loved, all together. He placed a simple wooden marker, Shadow. He knew justice. He knew love. He knew peace. The other horses gathered around the grave as if paying their respects. And Thomas stood there for a long time, remembering the wild, terrified animal he'd bought for $5. Remembering the journey they'd taken together. Remembering everything that horse had taught him about pain, about healing, about second chances. 2 Clouds came to the funeral. "He's with her now," the old man said. "With Sarah, running together in the spirit world, finally free." Thomas nodded, unable to speak. "You gave him what he needed most," 2 Clouds continued. Not just care for his body, but someone who listened to what he was trying to say. Someone who believed in him when everyone else called him cursed. That's the greatest gift one being can give another. To be heard, to be believed. After 2 clouds left, Thomas returned to the barn. The other horses needed care. Life went on. But that night, as he sat by his fire, he took out Sarah's journal. He'd kept it all these years. He turned to the last page she'd written. Shadow is the only one I trust now. He's the only one who doesn't want anything from me except love. Thomas picked up a pen. Below her final words, he wrote, I found you, Sarah. Shadow made sure of it. He never gave up. And he helped me find my way back to life. You would be proud of him. I hope wherever you are, you know that he was the best horse I've ever known. The most loyal, the most courageous. He loved you until his last breath. And I promise you, I'll continue his work. Every horse that comes here will be treated with the kindness you showed him. That's his legacy. That's your legacy. He closed the journal and placed it back in its special box. And for the first time in years, Thomas Whitaker didn't feel haunted by the past. He felt grateful for it. Grateful for the broken horse that taught him how to heal. Grateful for the tragedy that led him to purpose. Grateful for the reminder that even in our darkest moments, even when we're most lost, there's always a chance for redemption. Always a chance to find our way back to the light. And so ends the story of the lonely farmer who bought a horse nobody wanted and discovered that sometimes the things the world calls cursed are actually crying out for justice. Shadow wasn't dangerous. He was desperate. Desperate to save his friend. Desperate to be heard. And when he finally found someone who would listen, he brought peace not just to Sarah's memory, but to a broken man who'd forgotten how to live. What would you have done? If you'd heard the stories about the cursed horse, would you have had the courage to look beyond the superstition? To listen to what that animal was trying to say? Tell me in the comments. Your thoughts mean everything to me. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave your like. There's a new story every week here. Stories about courage, redemption, and the unexpected ways grace finds us. And don't leave yet. Click on the next recommended video on your screen. Another emotional journey is waiting for you. Until next time.